Okay, welcome back to social psychology. Today we will be talking about attitude change and persuasion after we discussed attitudes and how they are formed and how we can measure them last week. As I promised you, I tried to change an attitude or ideally a behavior of one of our participants. And as we all know, dissonance exists when our behavior is inconsistent with our attitudes. This is a typical picture of a cancerous lung. It's not a very nice picture. So what does our dear colleague has for options? He can stop smoking. That would be best. And maybe ideally in 2 or 3 weeks he will report that he successfully stopped smoking. He can also try to reduce his dissonance by changing his attitude and by adding cognitions that are consonant or inconsistent with his behavior. For example, in the small print it says, not every smoker gets cancer. So he can say, I'm probably the exception. I will not get cancer because I live otherwise a very healthy lifestyle. Or other people also get lung cancer, nicht nur bei Rauchern zu finden. So whether I smoke or not, it doesn't matter anyway, so I better enjoy my life and continue smoking. So he has a variety of options, and maybe you can all help me adding dozens of inconsistent cognitions by talking to him in the break, whenever he starts smoking, convince him that's not a very healthy behavior, okay? And you will report any progress or change as we go along. Okay, today we are talking about attitudes and attitude change and persuasion. But let's briefly go back to last week's questions. In the 3-component model, an attitude consists of cognition, motivation, and communication, beliefs, feelings, and tendency to act, acting, behaving, doing, or likes, dislikes, and needs. Yes, please. B. Beliefs, feelings, and the tendency to act. So you are among the 97% who got this question right. Beliefs, feelings, and tendency to act. Remember the acronym ABC model. Affect, beliefs, affect, behavior, and cognition. And remember that behavior does not stand for the action, for the real behavior, but for behavioral tendencies to act. According to balance theory, people strive to be consistent in their cognitions, average out negative and positive consequences for their action, calculate response probabilities relative to alternative behaviors, or maintain a delicate balance between conscious and unconscious motives. Und after a brief discussion, A. People strive to be consistent in their cognition. Only 61% got this right. So 39%, 40% of those who participated in the online assessment ticked one of the incorrect responses. If you have any questions, please let me know now and also for the other questions. Who developed the theory of cognitive balance? We came across this person 2 times. First when we talked about attribution theories, and then again last week. Yeah. Heider, Fritz Heider, thank you. When people form an attitude about something, direct experience can play a role. What is an example for direct experience? The mere exposure effect, vicarious reinforcement, the halo effect, or intermittent reinforcement. Yes, please.
I can see the halo effect.
Yeah, what is the halo effect again?
That's the effect if you have had an experience with someone maybe very beautiful and he was that smart.
Mhm.
You tend to think that everyone beautiful is smart.
Okay, or more precisely, it's about attributions to one person. So the halo effect is when you know that someone is intelligent, you also create some form of halo around this person and you think everything he or she is doing is pretty smart and good. Or also in some unrelated dimensions, so that when someone is looking extremely attractive, you may also create some halo and think he is a good person and he may also be smart and so on. Yeah, apparently many people got this one wrong. Only 39% picked the right answer. In hindsight, maybe it also has to do with the answer alternatives because, yeah, you need to have direct experience to create a halo. You need to have direct experience to form that initial attitude, or you have to have some prior knowledge about this person's character, intelligence, etc. And of course, also reinforcement involves experience. So when you see someone else in the vicarious reinforcement alternative being rewarded for something, then you make this experience, and intermittent reinforcement may be true to your own behavior. But the correct answer here was a mere exposure effect. I will make sure that in the final exam we will have less ambiguous items, but I can understand why some people have chosen the wrong alternative. But mere exposure, when you are exposed to something, then this helps you forming an attitude. The pure fact that you see things more often helps you getting a more stable attitude about this object. Dissonant theory and balance theory are both examples of accidental discoveries in the studies of attitudes, social identity theory, behavioralism in the study of attitudes, or cognitive consistency theories. Yes, please. Correct. And this time, again, most of the people who participated got this one right. Any questions to these multiple choice items or to the session from last week? Yes, please.
For example, do we need to know the names of the people who invented the theories?
I don't think there will be a question who created balance theory and then you have to write down Haider or pick Haider out of several else. I don't think there will be such a question. But when there is a question like in his attribution theory, Kelly referred to X, Y, Z, then it is obviously helpful that you can differentiate the model by Kelly from the model by Jones and Davis. Sometimes the name or the year can give you another hint of how to answer the question correctly. There will not be too many names. I mean, there are only a dozen names anyway that I mention more frequently, and it would be good to mention, to know the most important ones. Okay. I asked you in the online assessment or in the MOOC forum to go to the Project Implicit page of Harvard and to do one test of your choice, and then if you'd like to share your experiences. It was very interesting. Only a handful of people participated and shared their experience. I don't know how many of you actually did the test or some test in Project Implicit. Here's one example. Here's someone who apparently is from Western Germany, and he picked the test prejudice between East and Germans in the German test section. And he was surprised because apparently he had some more prejudice against East Germany than he assumed, because at the time of the fall down of the Berlin Wall. He was only 7 years old. And he suspected that it has to do that he knows Western cities much better than Eastern cities. So here we have an attribution that refers to the mere exposure effect. In the way, I don't have anything about East Germans, it's just that I have been more exposed to West German cities, and therefore I know the East German cities less. I think somewhere in his statement, in his original statement, there was also a reference to the validity or reliability of the IAT in the first place. Also, some other people who participated made some interesting comments. So one participant completed the race and weapons IAT in the US section, and he was quite surprised also to find that he can associate weapons more easily, more quickly with Black Americans or African Americans than with white Americans, because he also supposed he was without deep-rooted prejudice. We talk about prejudice in 2 weeks or 3 weeks' time in more detail. And another person did the test in relation to weight, both weighty or less weighty people, and he or she preferred thin people more than weighty people, and she was surprised. And the interesting thing is that all 3 participants, somewhere in their statements, mentioned that they had done some research and found studies or statements that questioned the validity of the IAT. So some researchers apparently say the IAT is not a perfectly reliable measure, nor is it a perfectly valid measure for assessing people's attitude. What do these people do without criticizing them? What do these people do when they do the test, find out that they are slightly more biased against one specific group than they originally thought, and then they question or challenge the test's validity or reliability? What kind of example do we have? Yes, please. Yes? Yeah? They want to, she said that they want to justify their behavior. They don't feel comfortable with the outcome, and then they look for some justification. How can we call that? Cognitive dissonance. That's again a nice example. Our attitudes are in some way inconsistent, and what we do is to try to add consonant cognitions or subtract dissonant cognitions for getting our system in more balance again. I also did some research, and for your information, there's a large meta-analysis published by Greenwald and colleagues in JPSP in 2009. I've uploaded this paper yesterday on the MOOC course, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. These colleagues did a meta-analysis. So they summarized altogether 184 studies. 184 studies that have used both the IAT and an explicit measure for various things, like, for example, prejudice against ethnic groups. So they both asked the people in the laboratory to do an IAT test, and also they gave them a classic questionnaire with Likert-type items, as we have briefly discussed them last week. The validity of these 184 studies with almost 15,000 participants reveals an average association between the IAT score and people's behavior or behavioral intentions, criterion variables, of 0.27. They only looked at studies that also had explicit measure. The average correlation across 184 studies with almost 15,000 participants for the explicit measure and behavioral tendencies or other criterion variables is 0.36. And this means both variables are substantially correlated to criterion variables. The IAT score a little bit less than typical explicit measures. But there's no question that the IAT also can be a valid measure of criterion variables under question or that interest researchers. So some researchers in individual studies cannot find strong relations or relationships at all between the IAT and the criterion variables they use. But when we look at the meta-analytic evidence from over or almost 200 studies, we do so that IAT predicts criterion variables almost as good as the typical explicit measures we are using. So the test, by and large, is valid, and there's also some studies that show it depends on the criterion variable. And when the criterion variable is open and explicit, then explicit variables or measures of attitudes are probably better predictors. When we have more implicit, some conscious measures of the criterion variables, then the IAT sometimes can even be a better predictor. Okay? And if you want to know more about the validity studies, then please have a look into that paper. Just for a second, I would like you to think about this focus question. You have just joined the army. Very unlikely, but imagine you have just joined the army. Along with other new soldiers, you listen to an amazing talk by an officer who is skilled in the use of survival techniques in difficult combat conditions. Among other things, he asks you to eat some fried grasshoppers. Try to imagine this is a real thing. You know you might have to do this to save your life one day, he says. Despite your first reaction, you go ahead and eat them. Would you end up liking this delicacy more if the officer's style of presentation was warm and friendly, or if his style of presentation was more cold and distant? So imagine you have just eaten a grasshopper, and then I would come along with a questionnaire and ask you how much you liked these grasshoppers. Do you think you report liking them more when the officer was cold and distant? How many think this is true? How many think you would like them more if the officer was warm and friendly? That's a slight majority. Okay, thank you. I will go back to this when we talk about dissonance later on. In general, today we will be talking about various models of the persuasion process. I will give you some real-life tips to increase what you want, to increase your abilities to persuade others when we talk about tactics for enhancing people's compliance. We will talk a lot today about the theory of cognitive dissonance, and I will present you the classic examples that have been conducted. And at the end, we will also talk about, are there any methods to guide us against attitude change, to protect us to be too easily persuaded by others? The field of attitude change is vast and complex, and a researcher called Howland headed the approach at the Yale University. This was funded by President Roosevelt in the beginning of the 1940s, and it was taken as a US initiative to win the war. They wanted Howland to study means that helped the American army to convince their own soldiers to stay in combat longer and to endure difficulties, and also to convince the American general population that it was good and necessary to fight the war against the Nazis. But also they wanted to see whether there are some means to convince the German soldiers to leave war and give up, or to convince the general German population to not any longer support the Nazis. So you have to see this research in this context, and it was an approach to communication and persuasion which studied hundreds of variables for several years. And this is basically the research framework. Howland and colleagues wanted to know different outcomes of persuasion and the communication process. It's a different question of whether I want to change people's attitudes, so opinion change, or whether I want them to take action change. It's different whether I focus on affect or whether I actually make people perceive things differently. Okay? So sometimes for some of the variables it depends on the criterion, the outcome variable. And it is, of course, most difficult often to change people's actions, behaviors, than it is to change their opinions. In order to successfully persuade people, in order to communicate in a more successful manner, 3 process variables were studied, and basically people need to pay attention. If people don't pay attention to your message, then it's unlikely that any change will result. But the fact that people do pay attention alone is not enough. People also have to understand what you are talking about. They have to comprehend your message. And finally, at least for lasting behavior and attitude change, they need to accept the key message that you communicate. Okay, so these 3 factors have been studied, and as you can imagine, during the communication process, there are various obstacles that hinder, for example, attention. When it's loud and noisy, you will understand me less well than when it's quiet in this lecture theater. So it has to do with attention. It also has to do whether you understand. If anyone here does not speak any English, then it would be difficult to understand what I'm communicating, even if you try to pay close attention, even if the circumstances are all fine. And finally, you have to accept this message. And these are a number of factors from the message itself, the source, and the audience that help understand when communication is more successfully changing people's attitudes and behavior and when this is less successful. Now I will present you just 1 or 2 examples. So source credibility, for example, expertise or trustworthiness, or whether you like people, is very helpful. And I will present you an example in a moment. Also, people's status helps a lot. So when people are of high status, then typically we believe them more than when people are of low status. Race is just a synonym for in-group, out-group communication. Typically, we believe those people who belong to our own group more than people who belong to out-groups. The audience does also play a role. Is there a necessary level of intelligence? When people are not intelligent enough to comprehend a complicated, a difficult message, then I would probably not be successful in my attempt to persuade this person. If my message is somewhat flawed, then obviously 2 intelligent people will notice the mistakes in my line of arguments and will also not be convinced that I'm right. People's self-esteem is important. Again, we have a U-shaped curve. You need a little bit of self-esteem to listen to people, to be convinced. But when self-esteem becomes too strong, then it can turn over. People's personality, if you are open to experience, for example, then you are more easily convinced than when you are not open to experience, and so on and so forth. I'm not going into the details for each of these factors, but let me give you one example. If I would ask you how many hours of sleep a night should we all get, what should be about the correct or average number of sleep for living a healthy life, then you would probably say something between 7 and 8 hours. So 7.5 or 8 hours is a standard answer. Bockner and Insko knew this from other studies, so they asked students in one classroom, how many hours of sleep do you think we should get? And something like 8 hours was the typical, the average answer. And in different lecture theaters, they then confronted students with different messages. And this message was saying, you only need 6 hours sleep a night. You only need 4 hours sleep a night. You only need, 4 hours sleep, 2 hours sleep, 1 hour sleep. And there was even a message saying you don't need to sleep at all. It's no problem. Physiologically, we can all live without any sleep. So this is a difference from the average amount that the typical American student in 1995 or so would say. So when the communicator communicated we would need no sleep at all, then the average, then this would deviate by 8 hours from the average opinion of the students. If the expert would say you only need 5 hours of sleep, we would have a discrepancy of only 3 hours, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing was that there were two different communicators. In one communication, this person was of low credibility, the red line. This was a YMCA instructor. He may have some expertise, but why should he know how much sleep I should get? In the blue line, this was a high status, high credibility expert. He was a Nobel Prize winning physiologist. So imagine you are confronted with a Nobel Prize winning physiologist who communicates to you that 3 hours or 2 hours or 1 hour of sleep per night is enough. You can see that both senders of the message had some impact or some effect. This was the final opinion of the students. So without any message, they would normally all say 8 hours. And you see when the sender was communicating a message that 7, 6, 5, or 4 hours of sleep would be enough, the average final opinion of the student slightly went down. And they do so irrespectively of whether it was a YMCA instructor or whether it was a Nobel Prize winner. However, you see here we have a turning point that the instructor with low credibility, the YMCA instructor, tips over, and you see that inverted U-shaped curve. When the YMCA instructor communicated that less than 3 hours would be enough, people responded with reactance and went up in their final opinions again. The expert with high credibility, you see the blue line continues to go down up until 1 hour. So even when people listen to a high credibility source of a message that says 1 hour of sleep is enough, they do change their attitude. They don't say on average that 1 hour of sleep is enough. They still think that you should get a little bit more sleep, but you see that from the original 7.6, 7.5 hours of sleep one should get, they reduce on average the number of hours they now think one should sleep by more than an hour. So the high credibility source is more impactful than the low credibility source. However, when the high credibility source does not appear credible at all anymore, then people again respond with reactance. And we talk about reactance at the end of today's lectures. And they go up again in the average amount of sleep. Okay? So this is one typical example of the research following Howland and colleagues' Yale approach to communication, and Bockner and Insko varied credibility of the source. This is another example by Chaikin and Egley. They varied source modality and message difficulty on opinion change. So they presented messages in written, audio tape, or videotaped format, and they manipulated whether the message was easy or difficult. And this is the amount of opinion change. So typically we would think that it is best to communicate by video, because then we have all sources, we hear people talk, we see people talk, and this might be particularly helpful. But as you can see here, this is only true for simple, for easy messages. So when the message is simple, then written messages have some amount of opinion change. Audio taped messages have a little bit an extra impact, and videotaped messages have the biggest impact, the largest impact on people's attitude change. However, when the message is difficult, you see that it is most their most impact stems from written messages, and both audio tape and video tape messages lead to lower opinion change. Because people can read written messages several times, they can put notes on it. So for difficult messages, the channel should be a different one than for easy or simple messages. One other aspect of the communication process has been studied. This is fear. When is fear good? Like putting cancerous lungs on packages of cigarettes, just as an example. That should arouse some fear. Lungs that are cancerous don't look good. Are they effective? Yes, they are effective, but only if they induce a moderate amount of fear and people believe that listening to the message will reduce this fear. If the message is too scary or not scary enough, it will fail. So I don't know about you, but we already have messages on the packages of cigarettes that they can do damage to our health, and other people says as well. I think it's damage to everyone. What happens if we put pictures of cancerous lungs on them? Maybe we already see the tipping point, and maybe it does increase too much fear, and maybe again the message backfires and does not have any impact. As far as I know from studies in Australia where they do have these pictures on the cigarettes, it does have a positive effect. So even these messages on average seem not to be too fear arousing, so that more fear leads to a more positive reduction in smoking in this case. But this is a typical curve we see. Some negative emotion, some fear is good because we see more attitude change. When the message becomes too scary, attitude change becomes lower again. Yes, please.
I think it's based in Australia in particular that the cigarettes cost $20.
You mean $20 in Australia is the reason why why fewer people smoke than whatever is on the package?
No, it's $20 a package.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to pay.
Yeah, but do you think fewer people smoke in Australia because of the price or because of the extra information?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. And it's probably difficult in Germany as well, because in Germany, over the last, say, 10 years or so, more and more information has been added to the packages, but also the price increased. So we really don't know whether it's a combined effect of both price increments and additional fear-arousing messages, or whether it's only one of these effects. I don't know.
When I was in Singapore, there was the same. They had the pictures of lung cancer, pictures of packages. And I don't know if it was psychology, from psychology, but I think they didn't taste as good as these cigarettes over here. Also, it was the same kind.
Okay.
Probably they might taste differently. I don't know.
In Asia, only the cigarettes are much stronger.
Stronger?
A lot stronger, absolutely, the same brand. So
But-
Marlboro
yeah.
Light in Indonesia would have the same strength as a normal Marlboro here in Germany.
Okay, but it's interesting. I mean, and one can imagine that you are saying that probably cigarettes, people still buy them, but they taste less good if you pay a lot of money or if you get these additional messages. You are saying they're stronger anyway, but maybe it's a combined effect again. Yes, please.
How we can assume that the same picture doesn't follow to the same induction of fear?
Yeah, you are asking whether the same picture has the same effect on everyone, basically. That's a very good question, and I don't think that we can assume that this is the case. I mean, if I go back to Howland's research framework, it will certainly depend on who communicates. Do people trust these pictures or not? It will certainly depend on the people that receive the message. So smokers, essentially, who buy their cigarettes, are they easily persuaded or not? What is their initial position? Are they strong defenders of the free right of everyone to smoke, or do they classify themselves probably as addicted smokers who would like to stop smoking but haven't managed to do so yet? What's the average intelligence, self-esteem, personality? All these factors would play a role in whether this message, the same message for everyone on the same cigarettes, is people pay attention to, understand, and accept. And particularly the acceptance will vary depending on the person receiving the message. Okay. Yeah, we already talked about credibility. Also, liking does play a role. When we like people, we are typically more easily persuaded. I already mentioned that we are more easily persuaded if the message stems from a member of our in-group, and particularly if it's a reference group. If it's groups of people we look up to, then we are more easily persuaded. We will talk about the elaboration likelihood model in a moment. Sometimes people engage in source derogation. So when a source, a sender of a message, is derogated, this involves sometimes deciding that the source is unreliable or negative in some way, and it can lead to all future communication by this person being less powerful. This is something that politicians often use. Politicians try to make the opponent look unreliable. So in the typical debates, in the pre-election or election campaigns, typically what they also do is they accuse the politician of the other party of having lied in the past to make the voters not trusting this source also in their future communication. And sometimes it works. What's about repetition? Repetition and also familiarity increases liking, but only up to a point. And you know all from advertisements, when you see the same ad in a 1.5-hour movie 3 times, then you don't like it anymore, but it backfires because you may also see the flaws in the weak arguments. So repetition may lead to tedium, may lead to finding us that there are weak arguments. This can be dealt with by and is dealt with by the advertising industry by having ads that provide slight different variations on the same theme. So you see the same product, you see similar themes, but slight variations of them to reduce tedium. And this has positive effects, positive in the way that we buy these products more. Yeah, we will be talking about one of the 2 models that differentiate between 2 basic processes. I will not talk about Chaikin's heuristic systematic model. It's basically assuming the same principles. It's using slightly different terminology. Both theories state that under certain conditions, and I will talk about these conditions in a moment, people are motivated to pay attention to and think about the facts in the message. And we call this the central route to persuasion. Okay? Under other conditions, however, people are not motivated to pay attention to the facts the message presents and only attend to the superficial characteristics such as who delivers the message, how long is it. And in this case, people are influenced or may be influenced via the peripheral route to persuasion. So this basically is the elaboration likelihood model by Petty and Cacioppo. We receive a persuasive message, and depending on the circumstances, we either use the central or the peripheral route of communication. When we use the central route, we have a high level of elaboration. We process the information very carefully. And depending on the quality of the arguments, our attitude change will be long-lasting. When we process the information on the peripheral route, our elaboration level is low, we are not carefully processing the information, and here our level of attitude change depends on the presence of persuasion cues. Last week we talked about the sexy female model standing next to the new sporty cars. And it will certainly depend on the context whether people form a more positive attitude about this car. The question is whether it's long-lasting or not. What are the circumstances that lead to whether we process via the central or the peripheral route? One determinant is personal relevance. The more relevant a topic, the more people will take the central route, and they will be influenced by the strength of the argument. And let's call personal relevance, or let's call this, all what's on this slide, motivation. So one condition is motivation. People will process information in a more elaborated way and use the central route when they are motivated. If you are not interested, then you, going back to Howland's model, you don't pay attention in the first place. But when something is more relevant to you, you should be more motivated, and therefore you are more likely to study all the arguments. And this is one of the typical patterns or a classic study. When the source is of low or high expertise, and they communicate with either strong or weak arguments. It depends on whether people are motivated, which is true for the high personal relevance condition, or less motivated, which is true when it's less personally relevant to them. And you see, when it's of less personal relevance, people change their attitudes when the source is of high expertise. So you may take the Nobel Prize winning physiologist here again, and this physiologist may present his arguments for reducing your typical amount of sleep to 3 or 4 hours, and he may have strong or weak arguments. And you see that people change their attitude, they agree with what the message communicates when they are provided by high expertise sources, compared to when the source is of lower expertise, the YMCA instructor, but people are less good of distinguishing between the quality of the argument. So even when the high expertise source presents weak arguments, people change their attitudes. And when the low expertise source presents strong arguments, people change their attitudes less than for the high expertise source condition. However, when you look at the high personal relevance condition, you see that people pay less attention to whether the whether the source is an expert or not, but they do pay a lot of attention to whether the arguments are good or not. And here's an example. In 2009, we asked bachelor students in the introduction week about their attitudes towards additional exams. So typically, students don't like additional exams. Of course not. Who wants to do additional exams? But we had both strong and weak arguments. In the strong argument condition, for example, we said other universities who have more exams show that the students get more jobs after graduation quickly. In the weak arguments condition, we just said, and many exams makes our lives as teachers easier, for example. How did we manipulate relevance? We manipulated relevance by saying, you are in the first semester, we are talking about something and we are using your arguments and your ideas and your feedback because in a couple of years' time we will have to re-accredit our bachelor program and maybe we use some of this information then. In the high personal relevance condition, we said we have just formed a committee and this committee is to develop new guidelines that will take place next year. which would have meant these students who had just started would have had also to do more exams if they agreed. And what you see is in the low personal relevance condition, there's little attitude change. So in case of weak arguments, people develop slightly negative attitudes towards more exams. In the strong arguments condition, they developed very slightly positive attitudes towards additional exams, but there's not a lot of a difference. You see, when the messages were sent under the high relevance condition, people paid closer attention and were more different or different depending on whether they were in the high or in the low or weak argument conditions. When the arguments were weak, people who were motivated because of high relevance spotted or realized that these were weak arguments and therefore changed their attitudes even negatively, less towards additional exams, whereas those who were highly motivated processed the information carefully and formed a more positive attitude towards additional exams because they realized that the arguments were good. Okay? So motivation is one important variable. But the route to attitude change also depends on people's ability. So if we go back to Howland's model, first people need to pay attention. And if you are not motivated, you don't pay attention. If you are motivated, you do pay attention. The second factor, however, is ability. According to Howland's model, you have to comprehend, you have to understand the arguments and the message. Let's say you want to buy a new computer and you are an IT illiterate. You have no idea about computers. You are highly motivated because you know computers are important for your studies and you know they are expensive, so you are highly motivated. But you may be not able to process all the information about gigabytes and megahertzes and all this information. And again, you are probably more influenced by the nice person who sells the computer to you, by the colorful ads, by a nice case of the computer rather than what's in the inside, etc. So these are the two important conditions, motivation and ability. Yeah, and if we are motivated and if we are able to process the information carefully, it depends on the quality of the arguments. If the arguments are good, attitude change will be more long-lasting. Where sometimes when we are not able or not motivated, or when we are both not able and motivated, we may also change our attitudes. But this attitude change may be short-lived and may not last as long as when we process the information via the central route. Okay, this is similar to the fear-arousing messages. People want to preserve good mood. When you are in a good mood, you want to preserve that good mood. That's kind of a universal motive of every human. When we are in a good mood, we don't want to actively go into a bad mood. Therefore, we avoid activities that might spoil our good mood. And this means that people in good moods often avoid paying close attention to persuasive communication because they think, oh, this may lower my mood. You don't have to buy oil, but if I would like to convince you to get petrol for your car from a certain brand, like I would like to convince you to only buy Shell or Aral or Texaco gas or petrol. When should I do that? In summer or at winter time?
I would say winter time, because in winter time people more often use the car, and summertime maybe more bicycle.
Okay, interesting, and okay, in the winter people use more the car than their bicycle, so they need petrol, and I may have good arguments for that, and therefore people buy my petrol. Yes, you?
I just think that people in winter maybe are not that euphoric about everything and are more like in kind of autumn depression, maybe are more open to.
Okay, you are saying that people are typically, during the winter time, they are in a less good mood, and therefore I'm more easily to persuade them. Any other idea? Yes, please.
I think you should do it on summertime because I'm not really sure, but I think petrol is less expensive, for example, in summertime.
Okay.
So it's easier to persuade persons.
Okay, when maybe petrol is cheaper in the summer, therefore it's easier to persuade them?
I think we should do it in the winter because it seems like in winter time everything moves slower, so people have more time, they have more time to listen.
Okay.
They don't want to rush and get out in the sun.
Okay, just so again some argument in favor of winter. So it's probably in reality it's relatively complex, but none of you have referred to the quality of the arguments. Is there a really good argument for buying Shell rather than Aral or buying Texaco rather than Esso? No, there isn't. It's all the same stuff. It's just the color that's a little bit different. It's even the exact same price most of the days. So there's no good argument. And if I don't have good arguments, I should do it in the summer because people are more positive in the summer, as you said. In the wintertime, they are more critical, are in a bad mood, so they will process my arguments more thoroughly, more carefully. And then they will realize that I don't have any real arguments for buying Shell petrol rather than the other brands. Okay? Okay, and now again, or continuing with real-life practical tips for you. A variety of techniques that deal with ways of inducing another person to comply with our requests. Think about a request you would...
Sorry, just one question coming back to the example with the petrol. You mentioned that we need these two factors, motivation and ability.
Yeah.
As mentioned in the auditorium, perhaps it can be that some other people aren't that motivated to buy petrol because they're going by bike. So this would be perhaps a negative effect over here.
If people are not motivated or not able to understand my arguments, then I should use a peripheral route anyway, because I don't have good arguments. I don't have good arguments for buying this, so people would easily spot this when they process on the central route. Therefore, I should go the peripheral route, which I can do in the summer because people are more in a good mood and they will not process the information. If they are not motivated and or able in the first place, then I only have this peripheral route left anyway. Okay, think about a request that you would like to make tonight to your partner, children, people you live with in the WG or whatever. Think about something that you really want to get from them when you get home from the lecture or this evening or afternoon. Maybe you want them to give you some money, borrow you some money or give you some money. Maybe you want them to invite you to a nice dinner or to the movies. Maybe you want to make them clean up the room or do some shopping for you, some request, okay? Every one of you has one request that you will make tonight to one other person. And now I'm presenting you with 3 different strategies that you can use to make these people comply with your request. The first strategy is called the foot in the door technique. So say you want to convince your father that he gives you another 200 euro, because we already had the 13th of November and you have run out of money because Frankfurt is such an expensive city. Okay, you want 200 euro. The foot in the door technique would suggest, ask your father for a small favor first. Ask your father maybe to borrow you his car for half an hour because you have to do some heavy shopping. Your father is most likely to grant you that request or grant you this. So you use his car, you do a little bit of shopping, you thankfully return the car to him, and your father sees himself as a very helpful, positive, nice person who is concerned about his child's well-being. And 10 minutes later, you make that bigger request that you originally had in mind. You didn't do any shopping at all. You just circled around the block with the car. It would create a lot of cognitive dissonance in your father if he would not give you the 200 euros then, because he has just experienced himself as a helpful person. So adding incongruent cognitions to that would spoil his good mood and would also make him feel bad. Okay? Second possibility, say you want something to clean up the whole WG tonight. Someone who is typically very lazy, and typically it's probably you who is doing all this work. So you want to get the real lazy person to do all the cleanup of the whole room. And the door in the face techniques would ask you to ask this person for a really large favor. Something like, maybe you have a dog, an animal, and you would say, oh, I'm going on a summer school for the next 2 weeks, so can you please look after my dog for the next 2 weeks and make sure that he gets his food and is being out for 2 hours, 3 times a day, etc. A really large request that you know the other person cannot possibly accept. How does it make this person feel? It makes this person feel bad. He is not a very helpful person. You made this halfway sensible request. This person understands that you need someone looking after your dog, but he cannot accept. And then you make this other request. You want them to clean up the kitchen or the flat. In order to restore his attitude of himself as a helpful and nice guy, he would probably grant you your request more easily. Okay? The final thing is lowballing technique. Car dealers often use that. So they say, okay, I give you that car for 10,000 euro, and I will also make sure that there will be some extras in it. And you agree, and you are almost ready to sign, and then the car dealer says, oh, but there's one thing, I need to ask my boss, because I've made such a good deal, and for every car we sell under 20,000 euro, I need to have approval of my boss. And then he returns and he says, I'm sorry, I cannot give it to you for 10,000 euros. That's not possible, but I can give you a similar car for a similar price, but without the extras. And you are more likely to agree to this offer then. I'm not sure how you can translate this tonight. Maybe let's stick to the first 2 techniques, foot in the door and door in the face technique. So think about which technique you would like to use tonight, door in the face or foot in the door, and then write in the forum how successful you were. And if every one of you, say, gets 100 euro, then I would like to have 10% of that on my personal bank account. Let me get you some examples for how these tactics were explored in research and in experiments. No, this was not Hangman. This is the name of a street in Warsaw, in Poland, that does not exist. So it's not a name of a street, but it sounds like a name of a street. Is anyone here of Polish origin or someone who speaks some Polish? No one? Okay. Then we will never know how to pronounce this. Imagine you are on the streets of Warsaw and you are asked for help by a stranger who shows you a little note with this street written on it. And this street does not exist, or it's written in such illegible writing that it may exist, but the person you are asking does not know anyway because he cannot read your note. Some people say, yeah, it's next street right and then turn left again and then it's straight, straight, straight. It's good that it's only very few people. Most people, that's the blue bars, almost 100%. There are 5% or 2% of people who give you some address and some directions. But almost everyone says, I'm sorry, I don't know. How do these people feel? How would you feel when someone is approaching you, apparently a stranger, just arrived at Frankfurt main station, you are a local, you should know about this city, and he is asking you about directions for a street that you have never heard of. And you say, I'm sorry, I'm from Frankfurt, but I've never heard about this street, try someone else. It's not that your whole day is ruined, but you feel slightly uncomfortable. We typically don't like to refuse helping people with small requests like giving directions. Okay, so you feel a little bit bad about yourself and then you wander on and at the end of the street, a young lady is asking you, oh, here are my heavy suitcases. Can you please look after them for a few minutes because I have to go up in the 5th floor of the next building to see a friend who I have to tell something. Can you please have a look at my suitcases and make sure that no one steals them? In a control group, without any previous request, you see that slightly fewer than 40% of people agree. We don't typically do that, waiting for a couple of minutes until that lady is going up and down again, and who knows how much time she really needs to talk to her friend. So we typically don't do that. The majority of people refuses to look after the bag or the luggage. When they have been put in a slightly bad mood or have been made to refuse a small request first, however, you see they are much more likely than the control group to agree to the large requests. So this is a foot in the door technique in one variation.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
You said at standing again in the train station, if there were beggars that worked in groups, like 2 of them, and the first one would ask you first for €50, of course we would laugh. The next one would ask you for 5, would give 2.
I'm not sure whether this is helpful in every situation, but it's clearly better if people make somewhat, and often beggars do that. So they ask you for some money, and if you refuse, they are asking you, can you give me a few cents for me buying some food? Or do you have any food at all? And then we tend to agree.
Yes.
Yeah. €50 would probably not work. Otherwise, I would not be here. So these techniques do have their limits. Okay. Now the famous theory of cognitive dissonance. In which year did Leon Festinger invent the theory of cognitive dissonance again? Yes? No. 54, which theory did Festinger? Yes, 1957. And 1954 was theory of social comparison. 54, social comparison. 57, cognitive dissonance. Okay. Fester and Carl Smith's 1959 classic experiment. Imagine you are a participant in an experiment. You come into the laboratory, you do the experiment. and it is extremely boring. It's the most boring experiment that you have participated in so far. And social psychologists sometimes are very good at creating boring experiments, like making people sum up numbers and then rip the piece of paper apart, take the next one, sum up columns and columns of numbers, throw it in the bin again, do the same thing. When you do that to a control group without any intervention, typically participants in a social psych experiment do that for 2 or 3 hours until they go to the experiment and complain, because they get credit points for it or whatever. So it's a really boring experiment. Everyone knows it is boring. But at the end of the experiment, the experimenter gives you, or asks you very politely, he says, I don't know why, but we seem to have trouble getting enough participants. And outside there's a student waiting. Can you please tell him that the experiment was really exciting? Most people do that and say to the person waiting outside, who apparently is not a real student or participant, but a confederate of the experimenter, they tell this person, oh, the experiment was somewhat exciting, you will learn something from it. And then finally the experimenter is waiting again in the next room just before you get your coat and get outside of the department with a small questionnaire. And one of the items on the small questionnaire is, how much did you really like the experiment? How exciting did you find it really was? And now there are 2 conditions. In one condition, the participant is getting paid $1 for participating in the experiment. In the other condition, the participant gets $20. In 1959, $20 was a lot of money. That was about 150 euro in today's terms. So in one condition, you get a really small amount of money. In another condition, you get a large amount of money. And this is the result. In the $1 condition, people, after having told a lie to the person waiting outside, enjoyed the task much more than in the $20 condition. And they are also ticking the item, are you willing to help us again, more often or on average with a higher level than the participants in the $20 condition. This is surprising, isn't it? So typically you would expect people who are paid more who say, yeah, the experiment was really exciting. The thing is, cognitive dissonance assumes that the fact that we told a lie is at odds with our average human being's motivation to feel like we are honest people. And this inconsistency creates some threat of our self-worth, and then we can either change our cognition and say, okay, the tasks were good, so I didn't lie to the other person. The task was actually not that bad. Or we can afterwards reaffirm our self-worth by doing something honest or good to other people on unrelated tasks. This was not an option in Festinger and Carl Smith's experiment. So people had to change their opinions. And they have to do it particularly when they don't have any external justification for why they told a lie. In the $20 condition, they had this external justification. They could say, yeah, the experiment was shitty. I told the other person it was okay, but I got $20 for it. Come on, $20. Almost everyone would tell that small lie to anyone. The $20 added a consistent cognition to these other cognitions that were inconsistent. $1 apparently is not enough to do that. $20 is enough. And you see that the effects were quite strong. Another classic experiment, Aronson and Mills, also 1959. They announced on campus that new groups were formed, women's groups, female groups, I don't know what it was about. And they offered women the opportunity to join these groups. And the women who were interested in joining the groups reported at the laboratory, and then they were randomly assigned to 3 different conditions. One condition was a control condition. They could just join the group. And then they had 2 conditions where the women had to go through a mildly embarrassing or a severely embarrassing procedure to be able to become members of the group. In the mildly embarrassing condition, they had to read a small text with mild erotics, mild sexual content. In the other condition, and again, remember this was 1959, these young women were made reading aloud a text with explicit sexual content and very obscene words among them. Okay? Think about yourself. We don't like that. If I would ask someone of you to come up front and read this text aloud to your fellow students, you don't like that. You feel embarrassed. But you're probably happy that you are allowed to join the group in all 3 conditions. Anyways, so you are allowed to join the group, but the experimenter said, okay, but before you really join the group, before we actually make you part of the group, we have a little video, audio tape that we want you to listen and then to give us an idea of how much you like the group and how much you like the individual participants in the group. And then the participants were listening to a really boring discussion. So 4 or 5 people in that group were really discussing irrelevant stuff in a very boring fashion. They were mumbling. Parts of the audio tape was barely understandable. And then they were given this questionnaire. Okay, how much do you like these groups now? How much do you like the individual members of these groups? And according to cognitive dissonance theory, these effects were predicted. You see in the control group, the red bars, and in the mildly embarrassing condition, people were not finding this discussion very interesting. So 70, 74, 78 is the more boring part of the scale. In the severe condition, they enjoyed the discussion. They said 98 on the 100 score scale. Yes, I found that really interesting. So again, we have an incongruity between the severe rite of initiation, becoming a member of this group only by having done this embarrassing task beforehand, and the actual boringness of the group discussion. In the severe condition, they like the discussion much more. And the same is true for how much did you like the individual participants. In the mild and control condition, they were somewhat liking them and finding them interesting, but significantly more so in the severe discussion. The severe group, severe initiation group, had the problem of joining a boring group, but having done some real or invested some real effort beforehand. Another study by Cooper and Aronson a couple of years later, they invited again women into the laboratory for helping them losing weight. There was a control group who was just weighted. Their weight was taken. Where's the control? There's a control group. Their weight was taken 3 weeks after the program, 6 months after the program, or a year after the program. And you see, on average, in the control group, women apparently, when they don't do anything or are participating in any activity in this experiment, they gain a little bit of weight, on average 2 pounds after a year. Then they had a group with low expenditure of effort. This group was asked into the laboratory Oh no, I start with that group. High expenditure of effort. This group was invited in the laboratory, and they didn't do any physical exercise. It was a study on how much psychological effort can help us losing weight. And people were, or the women in this condition, were put under a lot of funny psychological tests. So, for example, for 40 minutes, they had to read aloud complicated tongue twisters. 40 minutes of tongue twister reading, and the experimenters were telling them reading tongue twisters helps us losing weight. So they came for one session having to do this a whole afternoon. They invested a lot of psychological effort in an attempt to reduce weight. In the expenditure of low effort condition, they did the same task but only for very short periods. And you see that in this condition it didn't have much of an effect. So there was no significant change in weight. But you see that when the women invested a lot of effort, then they lost a lot of weight. On average, at 6 months, they had 8 pounds less than when they started the experiment, and this continued even after a year. They had to justify this, and I'm very sure that they didn't lose weight because they read the tongue twisters aloud. They lost weight because they went through this high effort condition and probably had to justify that they participated in this course in the first place by doing other activities later on that helped them reduce weight. This group didn't have any incongruity. They joined a group, they did a little bit of exercises, tongue twisters, etc., and then they were left alone. So no changes. This group, for some reason, didn't do anything and gained a little bit of weight, but the difference here is not substantial. This group needed to do something to overcome the problem of having done something that is incongruent with what we normally do, investing a whole afternoon in completely senseless things. And now to our question of the warm and friendly or the cold and distant officer. It was exactly as it was described in the focus question. A group of young cadets was made eating grasshoppers by an officer who was either friendly or distant. Now apparently some of the soldiers said, no, I wouldn't eat them, full stop. These are the non-eaters. And if you ask these people later on, how much do you like grasshoppers? They say, no, I don't like them, irrespectively of whether the officer was positive or negative, friendly or not so friendly. The big difference is in the group who ate the grasshoppers and was then asked whether they liked them or not. And it's probably opposite to what you initially thought. Some people agreed, or some people said that it is probably the positive officer. Some people said it's probably the cold and distant officer, and those people were right. You see that when the officer was cold and distant, almost 60% of the ones who had eaten the grasshoppers afterwards said, I would like them and I would eat them again. In the positive officer condition, only 15% said that this was the case. And it's probably because they had this extra justification. In the positive officer condition, they could say, okay, I ate them, but I only ate them because this guy was so nice and so warm. In this condition, they said, okay, I ate them despite the fact that I don't like the person who made me eating them. So they needed an extra justification, so they changed their attitudes towards being more positive. So these are, I don't know, 5 classic experiments of cognitive dissonance theory that you should all know. And the effects were all very substantial, highly significant, and in all 4 cases, I think in some ways counterintuitive. Typically, you would expect people liking them more when you're positive to them. Typically, you would expect finding group discussions more interesting when you didn't have to invest a lot of effort. Typically, you would think that people like experiments more when they are paid $20. But the opposite was true in every experiment. And it was perfectly in line with Festinger and other people's, including Carl Smith's, reasoning that the cognitive tension that arises from having inconsistent attitudes and behavior or two different sets of attitudes leads you to look for an external justification. And when there is no external justification, you then start changing your attitudes. Okay? The final few slides I would spend on resistance to persuasion. Of course, sometimes we want to persuade people to do something, we would like to do them, and then it's good to assume that if we do it incorrectly, they will show reactance to my attempts to persuade them. So it's good to know about these processes. But often it's also the other way around. The world around us tries to persuade us doing things that we would not normally like to do. Spending effort for other people, cleaning up the flat, although it's someone else's duty, purchasing products now that we are short before Christmas that we don't really need, etc. So it's also good for you to know how we can resist or overcome persuasion. Forewarning is one thing, inoculation defense is one thing, and attitude inoculation is one way to bolster people against persuasion attempts by having them consider arguments for and against their attitude before someone attacks them. This is, for example, quite helpful when you have young children. Prepare your children with counter attitudes before someone else does it. This was invented or studied systematically by William McGuire in the 1960s. He used some attitude inoculation procedures by exposing people to small doses of the arguments against their position. This induced them to counter-argue and provide some sort of vaccination that helps them warding off later, stronger attitude attempts. It sometimes helps combating affectly or persuasion techniques that are based on affect. Typically, say, when do people start smoking for the first time? It's when we are among our peers at the age of 8 or 9, or some late starters when they are 12 or 13. And what do these peers do? They try to get to our affect. Oh, smoking is cool. And if you don't smoke, you are not a cool guy. Okay? So that's affectively based peer pressure. It's an attempt to persuade us of doing something that we know is not good for us, because our parents have told us that it is not good for us. So, and it's good to combat this with some doses of inoculation and telling people how cool it really is or it is not, to help them resisting this peer pressure. We have to be very careful, though. This is typically what parents do. We have to be very careful, though, not to increase reactance in our children, which backfires. And this has been studied by Jacques Brehme. Jacques Brehme was a student of Leon Festinger. He did his PhD with Leon Festinger, and he wanted to do something different from cognitive dissonance theory, because Festinger made him always doing what Festinger wanted him to do. So he reacted against this with developing some sort of cognitive reactance. And this research suggests that when we feel illegitimately suppressed in our freedom to act, then we sometimes do the opposite than what people want us to do. And we, as parents, for example, have to be careful to be not strict or not to use a heavy hand when we prohibit things in our children. Sometimes you can also turn it upside down. So, for example, when we want our children to eat broccoli, we could tell them, oh, no, you're not allowed to eat broccoli. only once a week and only after you have finished the 1 liter bottle of Coca-Cola. Otherwise, broccoli, no, no, no. And maybe I allow you a little piece, but don't tell your mother because you know you are not allowed to eat broccoli. Well, what does this influence? The child probably thinks, if it's so strongly forbidden, then I should probably try it. And to justify the effort, this child will like it more. It's similar to the grasshopper thing, okay? Das ist so lustig. Okay, every human being has a motive to be free in their choices and actions, and if it's illegitimately reduced, then this may backfire, and we call this cognitive resistance. Sometimes it's good, though, to remove all sense of freedom. For example, when we educate our children. Typical example is the red traffic light. Children should not have the feeling that they are sometimes allowed to go over the red light, sometimes they are not allowed. And what parents typically do is, when children are very small, like 3 years old, the toddlers who just started walking on their own, they just keep him by their bags. So they cannot walk on the red light. Complete removal of the motive to be free in their actions. And if it's completely removed, they will also not feel reactance, and this cannot backfire. Of course, we should not do that in other things, but when it's life and death decisions, we sometimes can utilize this element and remove the feeling of freedom. Otherwise, we can also teach our children things, but we have to make sure that this feeling of freedom is not removed in an illegitimate way, but by explanations and by strong arguments and by making our children motivated and able to listen and understand our arguments so they accept the message and change their attitudes in a long-lasting way. Thank you very much.